Financial Survival Network, helping you survive and thrive in the new economy. Go to CarrieLutz.com and sign up for 30 free micro trainings on financial survival.
This show is now brought to you by Miles Franklin. And when it comes to protecting your wealth, you know there's nothing better than gold and silver. That's what I'm buying. I hope you're doing the same. And once you make the decision to buy gold and silver, there's no better place than Miles Franklin. Look, they've been in business 22 years. And the reason I'm a customer is because when you buy, they ship. Go to milesfranklin.com or call them at 800-822-8080 to get a free quote. 1490 WGCH. This is Carrie Lutz. You're listening to the Financial Survival Network, and it's budget time in Canada. Ellen Brown wrote a great article about it, that the world's richest resource-based economy is enacting austerity. She's here to talk about it now. Ellen, welcome back. It's been too long.
Thanks, Carrie.
So, you were up in Canada discussing this budget. What do you think of what Canada is doing now? First, tell us exactly what they've done, and then what your opinion of it is.
Well, the Canadians are engaged in austerity measures, just like everybody else, slashing services, laying off workers. They've actually increased the retirement age from 65 to 67. And they've reduced their health care. They had a really excellent healthcare system, but now, in the last decade, they've cut out more and more services, so that people are complaining about waiting in line and different things that you now hear about the Canadian Health Service. But at one time, it was healthcare for all, and it was prompt, and nobody had it. It was really good, and they did all that by borrowing from their own central bank between 1939 and 1974. And it was only in 1974 that this debt shot up. Of course, it's because they have this huge debt that they're worried, and that they have the leverage to be slashing services and laying people off.
Well, we kind of get into the realm of what the proper role of government is. So in Canada, we've heard a lot about their health care plan. It's basically national health care. And there's obviously problems with any health care system in the world. But at some point, does the programs like that get unsustainable, where you just can't give everybody everything they want?
Well, it was quite sustainable, and it was doing very well for 35 years. And what happened was the government quit borrowing from its own central bank and started borrowing internationally from private banks. And this was all actually a plot. Yeah. I mean, it's documented evidence of an actual plot here. In 1974, that was when the Bank for International Settlements set up the Basel Committee, which the alleged goal was sustaining financial stability. But what that was defined to mean that governments shouldn't be issuing their own money, and they shouldn't be borrowing from their own central banks, which was supposedly inflationary. But in fact, all banks create the money they lend on their books. It's just as inflationary to borrow for a government to borrow from a private bank as from a public bank. The difference is that the interest, if you own the bank, you get to keep the interest. So it's far more sustainable to borrow from your own bank. And the way that the Canadians were doing it for 35 years, the debt did not increase. If you look at a chart of the debt, it was very level for that whole period and very low, because they were. We actually did that as well during the 30s and 40s and 50s, and they were called self-funding loans. No, maybe I don't have the term right. But the point is that the loan itself, the thing you did with the loan paid for itself. So if you did housing, let's say you had a loan to build public housing.
Yeah, self-liquidating loans, I think
that was
right?
That was the word, yeah. Let's say you did housing and you rented it out, then the rents would pay off the loan. Or maybe you built a bridge and charged tolls, and the tolls would pay off the loan. So that's why, although Canada did all this development, huge amount of development during that period, and funded their participation in World War II just through the national credit, basically extending credit for the things they needed, calling it debt, but borrowing from their own bank, which created the money on its books. And then they paid those loans off. And so that's why it stayed level. The debt didn't just keep growing. And then when you look at one of these charts of what was paid in interest, it's the interest that's the unsustainable part. That's the part that goes exponentially, that goes into this big pyramid, whereas the basic costs stay level. Even in our own debt, if you look at a chart of our own debt, there's one on, I think it's on Wikipedia, or under national debt or something like that, and it goes to 2080, and it's showing the horrible things that are going to happen if we let our debt grow the way it is now. But the part that's growing is this great big yellow thing at the top, which is this big triangle, which is interest. All the rest is just stays level. So debt itself is not the problem. You can either call it debt or you can call it money printing. In other words, the government can either issue the money it needs and then collect it back in taxes in order to prevent inflation, or it can borrow from its own bank, which is just an accounting entry function. You just put a minus whatever X amount over here and then a plus X amount over here to balance it out. And then when you collect taxes or other fees, etc., then your minus zeroes out and the debt is paid off.
So, but when you're borrowing to pay for social programs, let's say we had no debt, which is like 15 or 20% of the U.S. budget now, I believe. If we had no debt, and let's say we're $500 billion in the red, so we pretty much just have the central bank, the Federal Reserve, write a check to the Treasury, and that debt gets paid back. But how are we going to pay it back without creating inflation? I mean, isn't that process in and of itself to fund social programs inflationary?
No, I'm writing about this right now. I'm writing another book on public banking. And so here's an interesting model that it was something circulating on the net as a sort of joke. But if you take, the velocity of money is 7.5. The velocity of money for M1, which is the money that actually changes hands, or the money used for consumer purchases. So that means that if the government puts out there, let's say $100 or $1,000 to pay for something, some form of work, then that money will go to let's say it's a builder. The builder will pay the grocer will pay the landlord will pay for some other product or service. And so 7.5 different people get that money, and they each pay taxes. So the average tax rate is 20%. So that means you actually only have to change hands 5 times in order for the government to get all this money back. But the point is that you've got to put the money out there first. And in other words, it takes credit. No, if you don't have credit, you can't run your economy. You've got to put the credit out there first, which is how you pay your workers and materials. And then they get together and build something, and that turns into a product which gets sold. And then the money from the product pays back the loan. But the way we do it, we say, oh my God, look at this huge debt. We've got to slash everything, cut back on services, pull in our horns. In fact, we should be doing it the other way and putting the credit out there first, getting the economy going again, and it will pay for itself. It will be self-funding like that. I mean, one argument against that model is that for products, you only pay taxes on your profits after cost, so it's not really
right.
20% of all the money you get in. But because the velocity of money is 7.5, not 5, it would still work out, I think. I mean, I'd love to see a real computer model on this. And plus, it has been shown that when you count all the taxes at all the different levels of productivity or producing a product, the real tax rate is 42%. So all that money is going to come back to the government, which means it'll zero out, which means it's not inflationary. It's not inflationary for another reason, which is that inflation results when you have too much money chasing the same amount of goods. But if you add money to the system and you use that money to create more goods and services, then supply and demand go up together and prices remain stable. And in fact, if you don't have more money, then you're going to not have enough money to buy the products, and you're going to wind up with, with deflation and recession, which is what we have now.
So what about the concept that you have to be creating these goods and services, and that the U.S. economy in particular isn't producing them? Then, assuming the dollar isn't the world currency, the world reserve currency, and we just stop producing and just print, then we have to have inflation, right?
Well, the money comes back. If with the circulation of money, it comes back in the form of taxes. That's one argument. Plus, the fact that we're not producing the same manufactured goods that we used to produce doesn't mean that this money won't go in goods and services. I mean, there are plenty of services that we need. In fact, you don't want to be producing too many things, or you're going to be, you don't want to be producing just so you can say, look, we're growing, because you will be using up scarce resources. What we really need is more services. There's a lot of things that need to be done that aren't being done. I mean, education is one obvious example. We've laid off all these teachers. Those people could be put back to work. You're not going to be using up resources. This is a different type of productivity, but it is a service that is worthy of being paid for, and that will improve our quality of life if we add that service back in. And there are other things like that. Like I live with my mother, who is 92, so we live in a senior village, and there are a lot of people around here who really need help, but there's nobody around. But so, there are things like that people don't even think about. All the things you could do for people as a service, like elder care is what I'm thinking, or child care, or any of those things. There are a lot of things you could do to help other people that would actually be a paid service and would involve an exchange. Money would change hands, but it would not use up scarce resources.
All right. Well, I think it's an interesting concept. I think it needs to be explored more, because the current system is obviously unsustainable, and every country in the world is, to one extent or another, on a collision course with higher or maybe lower mathematics, in that their debt will become unsustainable at some point. And if we don't find another way of doing it, then there's just going to have to be this global reset where everything has to stop and all debts really need to be forgiven, and we kind of start over again. And that's extreme and probably near fatal in the final analysis. So maybe your idea really is an alternative and a way out of it, where we can kind of get this done. It's just, my reservation is that government doesn't know how to spend money properly. It's kind of like giving your spouse the credit card and not giving them the bill that goes along with it, and then they go on this shopping spree and they've boosted the economy, but when the clothing is gone and the jewelry and all that, the debt remains. And that's my fear, that you can't trust governments to spend money wisely, certainly not as they're presently constituted. But I think we need to talk about that next time. Meantime, Ellen, if people want to learn more about you and your economic theories, where do they find you?
My website is webofdebt.com, and I'm also president of the Public Banking Institute, which is at publicbankinginstitute.org. And I have like over 130 articles, I think, on webofdebt.com.
Yep.
So
you are prolific. Well, hey, thanks for being on, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Gary. Great talking to you.